Hello, BookTube. For a long time, in the book market and the public speaking market, there has been a wide open money making opportunity revolving around young men between the ages of 18 and 25. Especially since the 1960s, that particular demographic has both been seen by potential moneymakers and also has often seen itself as aimless, set adrift in a world without an instruction book for how to wind their way through it, yearning for the job, wife, mortgage, retirement, gold watch certainty of their earlier generations. That certainty was almost always an illusion, but nevertheless, the yearning became stronger and stronger as post-modernity set in. And the aforementioned money-making hucksters definitely noticed and swooped in. And as a result, there's been a flood of TED Talks and motivational classes, and for the purposes of my own emphasis on this channel, books, designed on the surface to give helpful advice to those famously aimless young men, but really designed underneath the surface, and usually not very far underneath the surface, to rake piles of money out of them. And in recent memory, one of the most popular of these books is by Jordan Peterson, The 12 Rules for Life. He has become a phenomenon on the world stage because of it. He is a squintillionaire because of it. And I have addressed his book a few times on this channel. But it has recently come back into my life in the form of one particular young man who loves it and has organized his life around it and knows lots and lots of other people who have as well. The kind of people who will show up 10,000 at a spot to listen to Jordan Peterson ramble on stage and pay $35 for the privilege, who will wait an hour in line for the chance to say simply thank you while he signs their book. Since it came back up, and since it is now part of a discussion that I'm having out of BookTube, I thought I would bring it back up on BookTube since it is a book. It is book related. It is in the 12 Rules for Life. Jordan Peterson dispenses advice to that demographic. He would claim it's advice for anybody. Certainly there are lots and lots of adherents of this device who would say, no, my girlfriend gets as much out of it as I do. But it's aimed at young men between the ages of 18 and 25. I thought that instead of a general rambling discussion about Jordan Peterson, we would go over those rules one more time on this channel in order to, I freely admit, rebut them. The smallest amount of consideration or nuance rebuts these things on their own, on the face of them. They are bad advice given to you by someone who is not thinking clearly about what he's saying, or is thinking all too clearly about what he's saying, and the thinking that he's doing is not for your benefit. You here addressing those young men between the ages of 18 and 25, including one in particular from New Jersey, but I imagine that it's extrapolatable advice to a lot of other people. So I thought we'd go through these rules because Jordan Peterson is dispensing inaccurate, cryptic knowledge. He is dispensing inaccurate, cryptic knowledge. That's basically what he's doing. And rule number 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back. This starts off right away. This Decalogue plus 2, it starts off right away with the invitation to interpret some of these things metaphorically. Because otherwise you are left wondering, in this rule and in many other rules on this list, why on earth anybody would bother to put this on a list of the top, presumably the top most important 12 rules for life. It is, of course, a healthy thing to have a healthy posture, but it does not reflect on your character or the worth or value of your life at all. Not at all. You could stoop over like a 90-year-old, and it wouldn't make a bit of difference. So what's it doing on this list? Right away, first thing on the list, you are encouraged very strongly, sotto voce, to think the author means something other than what he's saying. On its surface, it is good advice. All of the meanings underneath it, from the combative undertones to the obvious implication that runs throughout everything this guy has ever written, that his advice is aimed at men, not women, to the weird conflation of physical externals with personal worth. We'll move on to rule number 2. Rule number 2 is treat yourself like you are someone you are responsible for helping. This is another element that crops up all throughout these 12 rules for life, and also all throughout everything else, that all the other advice that this man has shaped for that demographic, for the demographic of young men. And that thread is intense self-centeredness. This is an intensely self-centered rule. What does it go again? Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. In other words, help yourself. And I think it's not a big stretch to say help yourself before you help anyone else, and help yourself more than you help anyone else. And to this, I want to stress that helping yourself is not the point of your existence, or it shouldn't be. Helping yourself should not be the point of your existence. We'll move on to rule number 3, which is make friends with people who want the best from you. On the surface, like straightening your shoulders when you stand up, it seems like sensible advice. You don't want pits of negativity that you know. You want people who want the best from you, just as presumably you want the best from them. But notice, I have to presume that second part, because it's not in the point. The rule itself is only what they will think about you. And to this, the obvious rejoinder, if you're a normal person and not a sucker for self-help advice, is that friends are not staff. You are not assembling a friend group the way you would assemble a corporate team for a project with you, of course, as team leader. Friends can be caught up in their own concerns for days or even weeks at a time. Friends can be thoughtless. They still care about you, but they don't express it. Also, what about you caring what's best for them? That's not mentioned in the rule, but of course it comes first. It should be more important than the obverse. We will move on to rule number 4, which is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Leaving aside the element here of pride, of arrogance, there's also, inescapably, again, the element of complete self-centeredness. Compare yourself to yourself. Don't compare yourself to anybody else. Compare yourself to yourself, with the understanding being that you will be a better version of you today than you were yesterday. But that whether you are or not, whether you're falling behind on some areas that you wanted to improve yesterday, or that maybe yesterday was a little stronger than some areas today, the focus is squarely on you and not on anyone else. What if someone that you know, one of your staff of friends, has a quality that you emulate? You're not supposed to compare yourself to them at all. You're not supposed to pay attention to that at all. It means, in other words, that you are not supposed to learn anything in the ways of improving yourself from anybody. Your yardstick should be yourself. We'll move on. Let's move on to rule number 5. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I want to point out once again, this rule is all about you. In this case, it's looking outward from you. In this case, who you are and what you like and don't like is dictating to other people. Your children are not possessions of yours. They also aren't staff. They don't belong to you. Beyond a certain point of parental authority, of guarding them from making mistakes they will regret, what if they like something that will make you dislike them that isn't harmful to them or anybody else? What if it's just the way their personality goes? You're supposed to forbid them from doing it. It's not telling you, beware of your children doing something that might make you dislike them. It's ordering you to stop them from doing that. You are ordered by this rule to make them little versions of yourself, little reflections of you. It's entirely possible that one of your kids could develop a liking, an interest, a habit that is not harmful to them, it's not harmful to anybody else, but you don't like it. This rule prevents you from, it tells you you must stop them from having that. It's incredibly autocratic. And like with stand up straight with your shoulders back, we'll revert back to that for a minute. If you look at the rule, stand up straight with your shoulders back, you have two paths you can take with that rule. You can either say it's a metaphor for something else. You're supposed to take pride in you're supposed to stand forthrightly against the buffeting winds of the world or whatnot. You can either say that it's metaphorical, or you can say that it's literal. If it's metaphorical, it contradicts a later rule on this list and is a pretty sloppy metaphor. And if it's not metaphorical, if it is literal, then the author of this list thinks you have a relationship, him and you, that is one in which he can tell you to stand up straight. If it's the second, if it's the literal interpretation, that he's in a position where he can just tell you, stand up straight, put your shoulders back, then you see that attitude reflected in this rule about not letting your children be individual from you, telling them not to be. Rule number 6 is set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. This is the only rule on this list that is this degree of flat out nonsense. It's just nonsensical. My bugaboo with lists like this when they're given by almost any kind of self-help guru is in part the hypocrisy that's baked into them. The people who are making the list and proposing it, the people who are charging you $35 a copy of their hardcover book to learn these lists by heart, don't follow the advice. They don't do it. They are hypocrites. That has always bothered me the most. It's one of the things that bothers me the most about this kind of list of life rules. And in this case, it's not just that Jordan Peterson doesn't follow this rule, it's that nobody does, and nobody should. It is a simply childishly nonsensical rule. Set your own house in perfect order before you criticize the world is not something that anyone does. Not you, not me, not Jordan Peterson. No one. No one does it. If you invite a contractor over to your house to repave the bottom step on the front steps of your house, and when he's finished, the step is sideways and still wet after 5 days because the cement was mixed wrong, you will criticize him. You don't know the first thing about how to set a stair. You don't know the first thing about how to mix cement. You will still criticize him, and so on down the line. It is of course possible to criticize something without being able to do it. Of course, that is true. If that weren't true, the world would literally make no sense at all. And you would be at the mercy, I suppose ironically, of any two-bit con man who came along, provided he'd already conditioned you to say that you're not allowed to criticize him. Rule number 7 is pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. The obvious response to this rule is that what is expedient is often meaningful. I think we could all agree on that, right? When a heart surgeon has a patient in front of him, the whole patient is blocked off and anonymized, except for the one patch of area of flesh that is carefully marked. There are assistants all around. There's an anesthesiologist. There's a backup anesthesiologist. There are a bunch of assistants. What the surgeon does next for the next 4 hours will all be expedient. It's still pretty meaningful. And so on and so forth. It is another self-evidently ridiculous rule, and self-evidently ridiculous in such a way that you are once again forced to wonder, well, is it metaphorical? Should I be digging into it? Because pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, is A, hypocritical. It's not something that Jordan Peterson has ever done in his life. It's not something, B, that most people do. The expedient is often meaningful, so the rule is meaningless. We'll move on to rule number 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Again, I want to import language from the previous point. Sometimes lies are expedient. As adults, we all know this. There are little lies that make up the smoothing mortar of a day or a week or a year or a relationship. It's entirely possible that you will lie a little to someone in order to save their feelings. It's entirely possible that you will lie a little in order to save yourself from embarrassment. There's nothing wrong with that. Any child knows that there are categories of lies. There are levels of severity, and those don't count at all. They are the normal cockwork that gets us through being in a human society. So why on earth make a rule like this, especially since the rule maker himself is dispensing incorrect, cryptic knowledge? The rule maker himself is lying on several points in these rules, which drives me crazy. That kind of hypocrisy drives me crazy. Number 9 is assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. And once again, the thread that has run throughout these rules for life crops up again here, which is that this is intensely self-centered. There is an unspoken part to this rule. It's unavoidable. The rule won't make sense unless you include the unspoken part. It's not just assume that a person you are listening to might know something you don't. The unspoken part is, and then extract it. Extract that thing. You're not supposed to just go through the world assuming, oh, so they almost know something I don't. You're supposed to learn it. That's the obvious implication of this rule. Otherwise, it's patently self-evident. Of course, everyone around you knows something that you don't. Of course they do. They know what they ate for breakfast, and you don't. No, It's something important that you should extract from them. It once again centers the entire world on you. It makes everyone around you, whether it's the staff of your friends or anybody else, it makes everyone around you into a field of resources for extraction. They aren't people anymore. They're only meant to make you better, to increase your inner capital, your human capital, your empire. You should not only, what was the word again? Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't, but appreciate them for that. And wonder how what they know that you don't has made them into who they are. But any implication like that is out the window. You are in the world of these 12 rules, you are not supposed to think that way. But you are supposed to think that way. The world that these 12 rules open up onto is bleak. It is empty. It might get you your empire, but you will live in that empire alone. Anyway, we'll move on to rule number 10, which is be precise in your speech. I want to point out that a few of the items on this list, including a couple that we haven't got to yet, are only precise in speech if you are assuming that they are metaphorical. And metaphors are by definition not precise in speech. They are an effect of speech. They aren't direct. Some of the rules on this list, I'd say 4 out of the 12 at least, cannot possibly simply mean what they say on their face. Otherwise, you're dealing, if they do mean what they say, hey, stand up straight. Hey, if you're not perfect, you can't criticize. If they do literally mean that on their surface, then you are dealing with a crappy old crank, somebody whose lawn you wouldn't mow and who you don't want to be caught in a conversation with because they'll go on for 20 minutes about how the paper boy is throwing the paper the wrong way. You have to interpret this in a deeper way than what it says on the surface. So that's not precise. But I also want to point out, since we're talking about dispensing incorrect cryptic knowledge, I also want to point out that Jordan Peterson himself has never been precise in his language. It's his whole brand. There are entire hour-long comedy skits about how he is the exact opposite of precise in his speech. It's largely impossible to determine what he's saying at all. Much less, not a question of if you wait long enough, you'll get what he's saying. It's largely impossible, no matter how long he goes on, to figure out what the hell he's saying about anything. That is, I need not point out, the opposite of precise speech. That is the exact opposite of precise speech. And if he weren't bad enough, his acolytes take this to comical lengths. I could show you some comments that I've received on, for instance, if you look at or any earlier Jordan Peterson video that I've ever done, look at the comments section. As many of them as you could wade through, you'll be able to spot one of his acolytes in a minute. Because they're writing 1,000 words to say, I disagree with you. And they're using words that they don't even know. They don't have any idea what it means. There's a very stereotypable, very mockable, but yet very accurate, a lot of verisimilitude. There's a very mockable Jordan Peterson affect in language. What I'm trying to say is it's the subject of comedy routines. It's so well known. So this rule is shriekingly hypocritical. Jordan Peterson never is precise in his speech, and neither are his acolytes. So it shouldn't be on this list because that kind of hypocrisy is offensive. It ought to show you that kind of, it's on this level, this particular rule more than any other in these 12, that really shows what these rules are. If you see that kind of hypocrisy, if you know that the writer, therefore, of the rules doesn't mean what he's saying, then you have to ask what the rules are doing here, and there's only one answer. If it isn't that he means what he's saying, then it's the only other possible answer is that he wants your money. That ought to be offensive, I would think. Rule number 11 is don't bother children while they're skateboarding. Now, on the surface, this contradicts rule number 5, unless the children aren't your own. And I have a feeling that in this rule, the children aren't your own. This is a rule about how you behave out in the world, and so is the next one. If you encounter children who are skateboarding, don't bother them. Now, again, this absolutely invites a metaphorical interpretation. It practically demands one. Because otherwise, what are you to make of a grown man telling other grown men, you may be 18 to 25 and not have any idea what you want to do with your life, but you are a grown man. You ought to feel insulted at a grown man, another grown man talking to you this way. Not only because it's demeaning, but also because it's nonsensical. If kids are skateboarding on the steps of a children's hospital or an old age home, and they're doing it ineptly, and they've got blasting music, and they're falling and hurting themselves maybe, and they're making a lot of noise, then you do bother them to tell them to stop, to tell them to move on. I don't know if the subtext here is that Jordan Peterson wanted to seem hep or cool or with it. He's not square, daddy-o. Or that there's a deeper metaphorical meaning that his acolytes will no doubt have right to hand, but that's missing me completely. But if you see young people skateboarding in a skateboard park or, concrete ramp in a public spot that's not where they're not bothering anybody, of course you're going to ignore them. Why would you even need to tell somebody not to bother them? Unless they're in a position where you should bother them, and there are plenty of positions like that. So the rule makes no sense on its surface and begs you to interpret it somehow. I would argue that the reason why so many of these rules for life beg an interpretation of their surface level, because their surface level is nonsense, is because Jordan Peterson wants to be in control of that interpretation. I could be wrong about that, but that seems to me to be the most logical explanation. And then rule number 12 is pet a cat when you encounter one in the street. And I want to point out again, this contradicts. It will contradict rule number 11 unless you think that cats aren't people. I'm assuming that speciesism is involved here. Rule number 11 says don't bother people when they're going about their business. Basically, it says that. Rule number 12 says bother people when they're going about their business. I'm assuming that the difference there, the gap, is because Jordan Peterson thinks that, well, he's a revanchist, extremely conservative, arch Christian. So I'm assuming he thinks that all animals are here as playthings for him to do with what he pleases. So I guess I should count my blessings that he's telling you to at least be nice to an animal that you meet on the street. He could tell all of his acolytes to push them into traffic. But I want to make a few points here to finish up. One is that most cats don't want to be petted. And the rule doesn't seem to care about that. And this is not me hating cats. Most of you cat people would agree. Most cats don't want to be petted. And even the cats that do want to be petted usually don't want to be petted by people they don't know. Especially out and about, when they're out in the world, when they're doing something. A cat like that is likely to shy away from you, or scratch you, or bite you. And the rule doesn't seem to care about that. And I believe it's because the rule is harking back to a theme that runs throughout these rules, which is monstrous self-centeredness. The cat is only there for you. It's a prop on a stage, like your friends that you assess for their mercantile value, like the stranger that you assess for what piece of knowledge he might have that you could extract. The cat is only there for you. I'm assuming that, in other words, this is another crazy old man mowing the lawn in his backyard example of where the literal interpretation of the rule is so anile, it's so ridiculous, it's so shallow and trivial, that if that's all it means, then these 12 rules for life are a joke, an absolute joke. So you're invited to imagine a metaphorical meaning. Well, what does he mean by cat? Well, what does he mean by pet? Well, what does he mean by street? And that's not a far stretch, because he will indulge in that kind of chin-stroking nonsense at the drop of a hat. When a questioner asks him, what do you believe? Well, you have to unpack. What does you mean? What does believe mean? He does that himself. It may be that he's intentionally inviting all of his acolytes to do that with these rules. But my point in going over these 12 rules for life, this dispensing of inaccurate, cryptic knowledge, is that you shouldn't bother to interpret these things. They are dumb. And the rules on this list that aren't self-evidently dumb, square your shoulders. Your world has to be perfect before you can utter a word of criticism about anyone else. Pet a cat on the sidewalk. The ones that aren't self-evidently dumb, the ones that are self-evidently dumb, are inviting you to invent an interpretation in which they aren't. Well, this writer hasn't earned that from you at all. So don't do it. If someone offers you dumb, cranky old man, nonsensical advice, what you typically do when that someone isn't the squintillionaire Jordan Peterson is politely ignore them. That's what you should do in this case as well, especially since so many of these rules are suborning self-centeredness. which is already the defining quality of young men between the ages of 18 and 25. They already have a monstrous propensity for navel gazing, which is bad. It's icky. It's off-putting. It's something you grow out of. It's something you're supposed to grow out of. You're not supposed to hold on to it as a rule for living throughout your whole life. You're supposed to grow out of it. Adult men, men who have developed a well-balanced, funny, nuanced way of living, have had that kind of 20-year-old navel gazing knocked out of them by life. Well, why wait for life to knock it out of you with all the concomitant tragedies or disappointments that might come along with that? Why not get rid of it yourself, or at least start to? The world is a much lesser place. It is a much more boring place. It is a much more heartless place. If you're living it with this kind of navel-gazing self-centeredness, that's the wrong way to live. Not just because it adds another a-hole to the world, whether you wear a skin-tight, perfectly white t-shirt over your sculpted muscles or not, whether you make your bed in the morning or not, whether you clean your room in the morning or not, you can still be an a-hole. And one of the easiest ways for you to be one is that the only person you ever think about is yourself. So I would argue that since these 12 rules for life ping pong back and forth between self-evident stupid nonsense, like half the rules that we went through here, or a suborning of the key audience of young men between the ages of 18 and 25 to even more intense, weaponized selfishness than they're already inclined to. I would argue that since that is true of all of these 12 rules for life, you should dispense with them. Take the list, ball it up, and throw it in the garbage. That's what you should do with it. These rules are shot through with a very, very unhealthy way to live. So don't do it. So there you go. That is a very pointed response to the most successful, financially and I would say socially, the most successful example of someone preaching how to live to young men this age. I thought I would give it, since it's come up on my personal radar, I thought I would give it a more concentrated answer. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you.